I'd like to welcome our dietitian nutritionist, Shira Hirshberg. She is with All Foods Nutrition. Shira, come on in. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. It's so nice to see you on this lovely June day in downtown. So we are talking about some very specific topics this afternoon that a lot of people struggle with. We're talking about IBS and a very specific diet that is known to help people with IBS. We're talking about the FODMAP diet. I don't know if that's the best way to really say it.
Yeah, low FODMAP diet is common. I hate the word diet, but this one is more of a diet than most, but it's specifically a type of elimination diet. Okay. So it means that you eliminate this group of foods, high FODMAP foods, and then we bring them back in scientifically over time. So it's not meant to be, this is the low FODMAP diet, you do this forever. It's meant to be, this is a learning process and how we figure out what you're sensitive to, and then you have that knowledge going forward and you can make educated choices and say, yes, this cake is worth feeling terrible for 2 hours, or it's not.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start off with what is IBS? And because people hear that and go like, oh, I don't want to know, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to talk about it, but a lot of people are affected by this.
Absolutely. A huge number of people have IBS. It stands for irritable bowel syndrome. And it does sound unpleasant, and it is unpleasant for people who have it. And it manifests in a variety of ways. So people often don't like to talk about poop, but I'm here to tell you that dietitians talk about poop all the time.
We have
Parents
to, right?
talk about poop all the time, so get on board.
And if you own a dog, you pick up poop all the time.
all the time.
If you own a cat, you scoop it up. So that's what life is, right?
You get used to it, yeah. For a dietitian, you talk about food you eat, you have to talk about what comes out. It just goes together.
Right? It's life.
So IBS is a functional GI disorder, gastrointestinal, that's what I mean by GI, but that's a long phrase, so I'm going to say GI.
That's easier to say.
And functional, what I mean is that if doctors will look at your small intestine on imaging, your large intestine on imaging, they look fine. There's nothing obvious wrong. Even if they go right in there and do colonoscopy, endoscopy, everything looks fine, but it doesn't work fine. People feel symptoms, they have problems. So while the imaging looks okay, functionally they're having problems. And so doctors will diagnose this with a variety of ways. Often they will talk about your symptoms and do a diagnosis that way. Other times they will run a lot of tests to make sure you don't have other conditions that are even more concerning, things like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, things like that, celiac disease, and they'll rule some of those things out in determining that you have IBS. And so there are different sets of criteria. They look at different GI symptoms, things like abdominal pain, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, abdominal discomfort, frequency of your bowel movements, things that are in your bowel movements. Everything like that goes into a diagnosis of IBS. So the key thing is that if you think you have IBS, you should see a gastrointestinal doctor, gastroenterologist.
And probably track those things too.
Yes.
Instead of being like embarrassed about it, like keep track of it, because if you don't feel good, there could be something going on.
A symptom diary is very important. That's often something I do with my clients. If people kind of generally tell me when they come in, they didn't maybe come in for that, but they'll say, oh, I do have some abdominal pain. Often I'll ask them to keep track of it. Okay. And sometimes people will come back and say, I really didn't think this was a problem, but I paid attention to it for a couple of weeks, and it's almost every day. It's worse than I thought. Because people with GI disorders, often they're so used to them because they haven't gotten any help for so long that they don't even notice. It's kind of like background noise in their life. It's kind of like people who have headaches all the time. You just start to tune it out. But if you start to pay attention, often people will notice it's worse than they thought, and it impacts their life in bigger ways than they had realized.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so those are some of the things that you're looking for when you have IBS. And that's what, so if you feel like that's something that you're involved with, or you've seen a doctor and that's what you've been diagnosed with, and you found out what some of the symptoms are, what are some of the triggers that you experience when you have IBS?
So one of the common triggers is stress. So often people with IBS will come in and say, yeah, if things in my life are stressful, it's much worse. That's very common. Almost everybody, even if they're well managed with diet, with big stressful things will be worse with their gut. So that's a big one. Another one is these FODMAPs, which we're going to be talking more about, so certain types of carbohydrates. And then infections actually can be a trigger. So we call it post-infectious IBS, especially if you have like a foodborne illness of some kind. Sometimes people will develop IBS after that. And we're learning more and more about that and small intestine bacterial overgrowth, which is another very long phrase, frequently known as SIBO or SIBO. And that's a whole nother topic of conversation, but it's a little unclear whether this post-infectious IBS is actually that. So that's kind of in the works, and we're figuring that out as a little bit now. But often people will report IBS symptoms after they've had this big GI illness of some kind, foodborne illness, especially something that was really severe or required hospitalization, then this can develop.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about IBS, and if you have IBS, then you're familiar with this, you're familiar with the symptoms and kind of what you've gone through. So let's talk about FODMAP. For some people, you might be familiar with it, you might have read a little bit about it, it's starting to become a little bit more familiar to people, but some people this might be the first time you're like, what foreign language are you speaking? Yes. So what is FODMAP? What are FODMAPs? What is it?
So FODMAPs stands for a bunch of names of carbohydrates. I'm not even going to mention them.
They're very long.
They're very long. Nobody's going to remember them.
Yeah.
For instance, fermentable is the first one, and we go on like that. Oligosaccharides, right? We have these long names, but the key thing is that they're short carbohydrates. So starches, sugars, fibers predominantly, and those small carbohydrates are bothersome to the gut. So when we talk about the types, we'll go into them in more detail, but basically these are not well absorbed in the small intestine, and so they can cause problems. So
when you're talking about FODMAPs, what are some of those that you're looking at, and what are some of those that you're looking at?
Sure.
Let's start there.
There are a lot of foods that have FODMAPs, and a lot of people come in expecting them to be unhealthy foods. They expect me to tell them they can't eat cake and cookies, and unfortunately it's more complicated than that. So like I said, they're all carbohydrates. So while most people who are following the elimination part of the diet will be gluten-free, it's not because of the gluten. Gluten's a protein. It's because of the carbohydrates in wheat. So they're all carbohydrates. So things that have carbohydrates are fruits, vegetables, grains, things like beans, some nuts, agave syrup, so sugar-free products, some medications. So they're in a lot of different foods.
Okay, so we're going to get to where you can find all this FODMAP details soon. All right, so how come a lot of people haven't heard of FODMAP before?
So this diet is very new, and it's interesting. When I was doing a little research before we talked, it's newer than even I believed. So the theory was first published in 2005, and initially they thought it would help with Crohn's disease. But they only really tested the full FODMAP elimination diet in 2011. And then there's continued research going on today to test more foods and find out which foods have FODMAPs in them and how high they are. In 2012, they actually first tested the efficacy, how well it worked, when conducted with a registered dietitian. So if you come to meet with somebody who knows this diet and can help you do it, how well does it work for people? That was just tested, 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's pretty recent.
Yep.
So what kind of research has gone into this, and how is it related to IBS in two people?
So the primary group that has done the research on this is Monash University out of Australia. They're the ones who do most of the testing for which foods have FODMAPs in them. And so they're the ones doing the lab bench work to figure out what foods have FODMAPs. And now a lot of other groups have started testing the clinical efficacy of this, so how well it works if people try it. So there's now FODMAP research going on all around the world, but it did really start in Australia, and they've done most of it. They're one of the people that have one of the apps, and so a lot of the information comes from there.
Okay, so if you see kangaroo on the FODMAP list,
that is why.
You'll know why. Because I looked into that, and I'm like, what? So yeah, now you know why. You helped me out with that. All right, so as you're looking into FODMAPs, and we talked a little bit about why, it's just that your small intestine can't digest this stuff.
Right.
So kind of just explain that to me. For people who are trying to eliminate this, as you're going through the FODMAP diet, just really, how does it work?
Sure.
How do we even do this? How do you even start it? If you have IBS or you think you might have IBS, what do you even do?
Yep. So in terms of, so we'll go back to how does it work, and then what do we do after?
Yeah.
So in terms of how it works, like I said, FODMAPs are small carbohydrates. They pull water into your small intestine, and that can cause diarrhea in some people who have faster moving intestines. For those prone to constipation, you might feel like a water balloon is filling up in your gut. And they're also kind of like fast food for the microbes in your gut. So the gut, the microbes in there are good. They're important. They do a lot of important things. Everybody has them. but these foods really feed them well. And then they produce gas as a byproduct, which can make people bloated, can make people uncomfortable, distended. Some people will say, I feel like I'm pregnant. They get really bad bloating from that, and can create pain, cramping in your abdomen. And so the combination of gas and water together in your intestine can also change how things move through your intestine and contribute to diarrhea or constipation. Yeah. So some people with IBS have diarrhea, some people have constipation, some people have alternating diarrhea and constipation. And then there's all these other manner of symptoms I talked about in between. So that's kind of how they work.
So getting rid of those seems like a good idea.
Yeah. So then what do we do about it? What's the second piece, right? So the way that this diet works is that you meet with somebody. This is very important.
Okay.
Can't emphasize that enough. Meet with a dietitian, because it's a really hard diet to do on your own. Doctors, unfortunately, don't have the kind of time that's necessary to devote to this. So I meet with people for an hour and a half the first visit to talk through this diet. And you just need a lot of help. No matter how well educated, no matter how knowledgeable you are, it's very hard, because there are a lot of foods involved. So you meet with somebody and then you start taking this stuff out. 2 to 4 weeks, usually about 4 weeks is ideal for the elimination phase, where you really have a very low FODMAP diet. And after that, then you meet with somebody again, so people come back, and then we set up the reintroduction phase. And the reintroduction phase is where you scientifically bring these foods back in one at a time in increasing doses throughout the week to find out what you're sensitive to and in what quantity. So for instance, I have some clients, they can do really well with a half a cup of beans, but they have 1 cup of beans and that's too far and they really don't feel well. So you have to find out these dose things. They're very important, because people want to have beans sometimes. Yeah. It's great to know you can have a little bit, but that too much will make you miserable. So we go through each of the categories. We find foods that you'll eat within those categories that aren't in other categories of FODMAPs. That's the complicated part. And then we set up this specific plan where you bring them back in. You still follow the rest of the elimination diet during that period, because we don't want to mess with the science, right? This is a serious experiment. And then at the end, we meet again and figure out, okay, now I have all of this information. What do I do with it? What can I eat? And actually, some of the apps will take that into account and help you incorporate that information. And the good thing is that there is a lot more information available about it now than there used to be, but it still is complex to do an elimination diet, and so it's really important to get help.
Yes, I was going to say too, and how much do you think it is valuable, not only from the aspect where you're giving them advice on what to eat and when to bring it back in, but just the support aspect, because it is so complicated to remove so much. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's pretty, like, if you go in and you look at this food, like, you're eliminating avocados, you're eliminating apples, you're eliminating so many things, you're eliminating soy. So for people who are vegetarian and want to take out,
that's especially tricky.
Yeah, it's really hard. So just providing support, someone to talk to, how valuable do you think that is?
I think it's hugely helpful. I think even with that support, some people don't follow through and finish the whole phase because it's hard. But certainly without that support, it's very easy to just throw up your hand and say, this is too hard, I'm not going to deal with this, I'm just going to accept this. And also meeting with someone is great because, for instance, there are some other things we can look for that might be contributing. Like I talked about, small intestine bacterial overgrowth is another one. Or, there are ways that I can modify it a little bit. Some people don't want to do the full FODMAP elimination. If you have certain symptoms, we can start with pieces of it. So it's really great to have help. But I totally agree that support is a huge aspect of it, because it's very hard. Nobody understands what you're doing. People understand gluten-free pretty well nowadays. People understand that, but nobody will know what you're doing or how to help or support you. So getting the resources and the person to help is key.
Okay, so definitely go through it with someone who can help you stick through it to the end, because then hopefully you'll feel better, right? Getting some answers.
And make sure that you have all the testing you need before you start. For instance, I want people to be tested for celiac disease before, because if you're going to go off gluten, you want to make sure that we know about that going into it. So making sure you have the baseline testing you need before you do it as well.
Okay, so that's really important, getting those things done ahead of time and doing it with someone, so you're not just out there doing it by yourself, figuring out. Where can people get good, reliable, solid information to get more information from this?
It's a great question, because the internet is a big place.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of things online about the low FODMAP diet at this point. So like I said, Monash University is the group that does the primary research. They have a lot of good resources. They have a little video on their website that talks about IBS, explains how FODMAPs work in the gut. They also have some things that you can buy, like I purchased their booklet and they sent it to me. They have an app, so I'm just gonna look at specifically the names for these guys to make sure I give you guys the right one. So it is the Monash University Low FODMAP Diet app, so that's a really good one, and they have a guide that you can look through which has red, yellow, green colors for the different foods. Kate Scarlatta and Patsy Quesos are two registered dietitians who specialize in this and have good materials on their website. Kate Scarlatta especially has a blog that has a ton of information. So if you Google low FODMAP, Kate Scarlatta, that will come up. It's katescarlatta.com. She answers a lot of people's questions about this diet that are very helpful and has a lot of free educational resources that you can look at. Also, she just came out with an app actually last week.
Yay!
And it's called the FODMAP Grocery Guide. And the key about this is that can be hard to grocery shop because you have so many restrictions, you have to change a lot of what you do, so this helps you pull together foods that you can just say, okay, I'm going to go to the grocery store, these are the things that I'm going to get. So those are some good resources.
That's nice too, because once you figure out what you can incorporate and what you just can't have, like what just doesn't work for you, it's almost easier then to grocery shop. Once you've just accepted it, then you're like, I just can't eat any of that. So like get in and get out of the grocery store like that.
This is the stuff that works for me. Now I know.
Now you know. Just once you accept it, work through it, then you're good to go. Like forget the bean aisle, right?
Yeah. And one thing I want to say about this is that it is a tough diet to do. But a lot of my clients find that they feel a lot better, not only because their IBS symptoms improve, but because you can't buy a ton of processed foods.
Yeah.
It's hard. There's a lot of ingredients. Figuring out whether they're low FODMAP is very difficult. So you have to eat a fairly whole foods diet. And people often feel better doing that. So, you know, some of my clients are actually surprised that it makes them feel better in ways they hadn't expected because they're cooking from scratch more, they're eating more whole foods, simple foods, and they have that benefit to it.
That's so true. There's so many things on there. And probably stuff, too, that people wouldn't necessarily think about. Like, I remember I tried parsnip for the first time, and I was like, I have no idea how to cook this, but we'll give it a shot, right?
Yeah, once your options are limited, you have to be a little more creative, and that can be a good thing.
Exactly. Like, the more you read about it, the more you figure out. So it's nice that there's new apps coming out. Do you see as this, we're seeing more research come about this and kind of more recognition come to this. What do you I'm just asking kind of your opinion.
Sure.
Do you think this is going to be more widely accepted, or is it more widely accepted now?
I think more and more every day.
Yeah.
I think that more people are hearing about it, there are more resources available, people are trying it more, and they are getting good relief. You know, I think I really love working in this area because it's one of the few places where you can make a great difference in someone's life very quickly. Yeah. So for people who have bad IBS symptoms, if this diet works for them, which is about 75% of people with IBS, it's pretty good efficacy. If it works for them, often they'll come back and they'll be like, I felt 100% better in 2 weeks. Or sometimes even, my last client that we did this with, 2 days. She had like horrible abdominal pain, bloating, and just felt completely better. So it's amazing to see that difference.
Yeah, that's amazing. All right, Shira Hirshberg, thank you so much. So we learned a little bit about IBS and the FODMAP diet. I don't know what else to call it besides diet, right?
Low FODMAP diet.
Low FODMAP
that's the name
diet.
out there. Sorry, if you Google it, that's what you find.
We'll just have to say that.
The low FODMAP lifestyle.
And it kind of is, right?
It is definitely a lifestyle.
All right, so thank you so much for joining us. That was great, good information, and you can check her out on her website, All Foods Nutrition, on Facebook page and all that good stuff. Thank you so much. It was super helpful. You too. All right, we'll talk.